Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a world where justice was less about reform and more about, well, public humiliation and outright brutality. Imagine living in a time when a bad breakup could land you in the stocks, or a spicy rumor could get you a one-way ticket to a very wet, very cold bath. You'll hear about punishments so bizarre, so cruel, that you'll be clutching your pillows a little tighter tonight, grateful for modern life, and for not being a medieval gossip. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening live, drop a comment with your location and local time, so we can all feel a little more connected, even as we're transported to a much less comfortable era. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a young woman, perhaps in a bustling medieval market town, and there's a new face among the merchants, a man with dark, kind eyes and a laugh that makes your heart flutter. He's not the man your father has arranged for you to marry, of course. That man is older, gruff, and smells vaguely of mutton and unwashed wool. But this new merchant, let's call him Julian. He notices you, too. You share fleeting glances across stalls piled high with spices and textiles. A secret smile here, a whispered word there. A simple touch of hands as he passes you a length of fine linen. It's a romance ripped straight from a modern-day television drama, except the stakes are infinitely higher. Because in this time, love is not always a choice. And forbidden love, well, that could be a death sentence. In the medieval world, romance, sex, and intimacy were meticulously regulated by a combination of religious doctrine, feudal law, and social custom. The church, in particular, wielded an incredible amount of power over people's personal lives. Remember, these societies were built on the idea of order, hierarchy, and maintaining the status quo. Illicit romance wasn't just a moral failing, it was a societal threat. A relationship outside of the sanctioned marriage contract could disrupt property inheritance, challenge a family's honor, and, in the eyes of the church, lead to eternal damnation. So, your little secret with Julian, the handsome merchant? It's dangerous. The thrill of sneaking away to a hidden glade outside the town walls to steal a kiss is intoxicating. The whispered promises under the pale moonlight feel like the most beautiful things in the world. You're not just in love, you're an act of rebellion. You're challenging the very foundation of your society. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these laws was spiritual salvation or simply the cold, hard logic of land and power inheritance. It's likely a messy mix of both. Let's talk about a well-known historical fact, the concept of chivalry. While we often romanticize it as knights rescuing damsels and a code of polite conduct, it was, at its core, a military and moral code for the noble class. It dictated how knights should behave in battle, yes, but also how they should treat women, specifically, noble women. Chivalry, however, did not extend its protections to the lower classes. A lord could be punished for seducing another lord's wife, but his dalliances with a peasant girl were often overlooked or considered his right. A quirky tidbit, some medieval romances actually depict knights fighting over a lady's honor, which was less about her feelings and more about who had the right to her and her family's land. See, even romance was a political transaction. The law was merciless when it came to forbidden physical intimacy. For a woman, a relationship outside of marriage, especially with a man of a lower social standing, could be seen as an act of treason against her family. The punishment for such an act could range from public shaming to severe bodily harm. She might be whipped, branded, or, in more extreme cases, have her nose or ears cut off, a permanent mark of her perceived dishonor. The man, too, could face a brutal end. Imagine Julian being caught with you. He might be flogged, castrated, or even executed, not for a violent crime, but for the crime of loving someone he wasn't supposed to. The act of adultery was particularly reviled, especially for women. A husband, finding his wife in bed with another man, could legally kill both of them on the spot in some regions. This was known as a crime of passion in a very literal and very medieval sense. The law protected the husband's honor and his claim to his property, which included his wife. A woman, on the other hand, had no such recourse. A wife could not kill her cheating husband or his lover. She was expected to suffer in silence or, at most, seek a divorce from the church, which was a lengthy, difficult, and often fruitless process. The distinction between social classes in these matters was stark and unforgiving. A wealthy noblewoman caught in a secret romance might be sent to a convent to save the family's name, her transgression quietly buried in prayers and silence. A peasant girl, however, had no such sanctuary. She might be publicly shamed, driven from her village, or even face the very real threat of violence at the hands of her family or the community. It wasn't about morality in any universal sense, it was about the preservation of a social and economic order. A lord's heir could not be the son of a stable boy, and the lines of succession and property had to remain untainted. So you and Julian, you know the risks. Every stolen kiss, every hushed conversation is a gamble with your very lives. The thrill is undeniable, but it's built on a foundation of terror. And what happens when someone finds out? A jealous rival, a gossiping servant, a watchful father? The moment of discovery is not a dramatic confrontation like in a play. It's a sudden, terrifying shift from stolen bliss to brutal reality. The law, with all its medieval cruelty, is suddenly right there, at your door, ready to extract its pound of flesh. This wasn't a world of happy endings, it was a world where a quiet life was a luxury, and a life lived on your own terms was a crime. Your secret tryst with Julian, the handsome merchant, has been discovered. You don't know who saw you, a sharp-eyed villager, perhaps, or a rival suitor with a grudge. All you know is that the whispered rumors have reached the ears of your father, a man whose honor is everything. The consequences are swift and terrifying. The law, as you now realize, is not some abstract concept, it is a heavy hand that falls upon you and Julian with brutal force. And in the medieval world, justice isn't blind, it sees your family's wealth, your social standing, and your gender, and it renders a sentence accordingly. You see, the severity of the punishment for illicit romance, or any crime really, was rarely about the act itself. It was about the status of the people involved. If you were a noblewoman, your family's reputation was paramount. A scandal could jeopardize political alliances, land deals, and the future prospects of your siblings. To handle this, a family might deal with the matter privately. You could be sent away to a distant nunnery, or married off to an older, less desirable lord who wouldn't care about your past, so long as you produced an heir. The man, in our case, Julian, a commoner, would likely face a much harsher, and more public, fate. The message needed to be clear: you do not touch what belongs to a noble family. Let's flip the script. Imagine you're a peasant girl, and Julian is a nobleman, a lord's son. Now, your situation is even more precarious. The lord's son might face a stern lecture from his father and a command to behave himself, but you? You could be cast out of the village. The idea of a nobleman having an affair with a peasant girl was seen less as a breach of romance and more as a lord exercising his right to do as he pleased. This was the deeply ingrained belief in a society where land ownership and social hierarchy determined every aspect of life. Your honor, in this scenario, was considered less valuable because you were, quite literally, a commoner. There's a mainstream historical fact that highlights this perfectly: the concept of droit du seigneur, or the right of the lord. While its actual practice is hotly debated by historians, some say it was a form of symbolic tax, others insist it was a grim reality. it was the belief that a feudal lord had the right to be the first to sleep with a newlywed peasant bride. Whether it was a widespread practice or not, the belief in its existence speaks volumes about the power dynamic between the nobility and the peasantry. The lord's will was law, and the commoners were, in many ways, his property. A quirky tidbit that drives this point home is the existence of courtesan laws. In some medieval towns, laws were passed not to punish prostitutes, but to regulate them. They had to wear specific clothing or live in designated areas, not because society approved of their profession, but because it was a way for the local authorities to keep track of them and, more importantly, to tax them. It was a crude form of regulation that showed that even in matters of intimacy and vice, there was a clear separation between the powerful and the powerless. The wealthy could afford their indiscretions in secret, while the poor were forced to live theirs out in the open, subject to public scrutiny and the state's coffers. Historians still argue whether the laws against forbidden romance were more about controlling female sexuality or about maintaining a rigid social structure based on bloodlines and property. It's a fascinating debate, because the two are so deeply intertwined. A woman's body was a vessel for the continuation of a family line, a political tool, and a source of potential scandal that could unravel a carefully constructed web of power. Her sexuality, therefore, could not be left to her own devices. It had to be controlled, managed, and, if necessary, punished with extreme prejudice. Let's return to you and Julian. Your punishment, decided by your father and the local magistrate, is not a simple fine. It's designed to be a public spectacle. It's meant to send a message to the entire town. You are marched to the public square, and placed in the stocks. The stocks, as you will soon discover, are not just a simple wooden frame. They are a theatre of public shame. Your feet and hands are locked in the holes, forcing you into an uncomfortable, hunched-over position. The sun beats down on your head. Passers-by stare, some with pity, most with scorn. Children giggle and point. And then the first tomato hits your chest, followed by a handful of rotten eggs. This is not just a punishment, it's an absolute humiliation. You are a living example of what happens when you dare to defy the social order. Julian, being a commoner, might face an even more brutal fate. He could be whipped through the streets, tied to the back of a cart, a public spectacle designed to break his spirit and his body. Or, in a more chilling display of justice, he could be branded, a hot iron pressed against his skin, leaving an indelible mark for the world to see. You are both being punished, yes, but the manner in which you are punished is dictated by the perceived value of your lives in this rigid, unforgiving society. The cruel reality is that for a brief moment, you experienced a love that was pure and beautiful, but in this world, love was a commodity, and you simply couldn't afford it. The whispers, the stares, the mocking laughter, it all serves a purpose. It teaches everyone watching a lesson: stay in your place. Don't dream of a life you aren't born into. Don't fall in love with the wrong person. Because the consequences are more than just a broken heart, they are a public, humiliating, and often violent end. And for the rest of your life, you will carry the physical and emotional scars of a love that was a crime. You're in the stocks, your hands and feet locked in place, and the humiliation is a physical weight as much as it is an emotional one. But the punishment is not just for you. It is for Julian, too. He stands nearby, tied to a post, his back a canvas of fresh welts from the lash. This is the brutal reality of adultery, or what was deemed as such in this unforgiving era. This isn't a story of happily ever after, but a harsh lesson in the consequences of loving outside the lines. And it was a lesson that was often cruelly, and very publicly, taught. Adultery was a sin, yes, but in medieval law, it was a crime. And the punishment for it was often savage. For a woman, the crime was seen as tainting her husband's bloodline, and by extension, his inheritance. The act of infidelity wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a challenge to the very foundation of patriarchal society. The laws surrounding it were a reflection of this. In some regions, a husband who caught his wife in the act had the legal right to kill both her and her lover on the spot. This was not considered murder, it was considered a just act, a defense of his honor and property. The law essentially gave men a license to kill in these situations, but for women, there was no such recourse. A wife had no legal right to harm her cheating husband. Her only option was to appeal to the church for a divorce, a long and costly process that often ended in her being the one who was shamed or exiled. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact: the concept of divorce in the medieval period was vastly different from what we understand today. There was no easy separation. Marriage was a sacrament, a holy union, and it could only be annulled by the church. Annulment was granted on specific grounds, such as a prior marriage, a blood relationship between the couple, or the inability to consummate the marriage. Adultery was not a grounds for annulment, though a person could be granted a separation, which meant they could live apart but could not remarry. The church, however, was notoriously slow and resistant to these requests, often prioritizing the sanctity of the marriage over the individual's suffering. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the harsh reality of this time is the punishment by a hair shirt. A hair shirt was a garment made of rough animal hair, often worn by monks and ascetics for penance. It was also used as a punishment for certain sins, including adultery. A person might be forced to wear a hair shirt for a period of time, the constant itching and discomfort serving as a physical reminder of their transgression. It was a private punishment, yes, but one that was meant to be a constant, painful reminder of their crime. Historians still argue whether these severe punishments were truly about morality or a form of social control designed to keep people in their place. It's a valid question, as the punishments were often more severe for the lower classes than for the wealthy. The wealthy could often pay their way out of trouble or use their influence to have the matter dealt with quietly. The poor, however, had no such options. Their punishment was public, brutal, and served as a deterrent for the entire community. As you and Julian sit in the stocks, you are not just being punished, you are being made an example of. The rotten vegetables and insults being hurled at you are not just from a few angry villagers, they are from a community that has been taught to believe that your actions threaten their very way of life. The crime of adultery was a crime against the whole community, a violation of the sacred bonds of marriage and the social order. And what about Julian? He is whipped, yes, but in some cases, the punishment for a man was even more brutal. He could be castrated, a horrific act that not only inflicted immense pain but also ensured he could never father a child. This was a direct assault on his manhood and his ability to continue his own bloodline. It was a punishment that was meant to shame, to inflict pain, and to remove him from the gene pool, as it were. The punishment for adultery was a complex web of legal, religious, and social expectations, and it was a web that was far more likely to ensnare women than men. The double standard was blatant and brutal. A man could often get away with a slap on the wrist, a fine, or a private penance. A woman, however, could lose everything: her reputation, her home, her children, and sometimes her life. The whipping stops, leaving Julian's back a bloody mess. The stones of the stocks are cold against your skin, and the jeers of the crowd feel like physical blows. But this, you realize with a cold dread, is not the end. The law, with its unyielding and brutal logic, has more in store. This is the crime of passion, not as we might understand it today, a sudden, emotional act, but as a formal, legal charge. Your forbidden love was not just a sin, it was a disruption, a defiance of the established order, and the justice it brought was violent, visceral, and final. You see, in the medieval mind, a man's honor and a woman's chastity were inextricably linked. Your father's reputation was tied to your purity. Your husband-to-be's family was staking a claim on your lineage. When you chose Julian, you didn't just break a promise, you broke a covenant. And the violent reactions that followed were often enshrined in the law itself. A mainstream historical fact that highlights this is the honor killing. While we associate this term with other parts of the world and other time periods, the concept was very much alive in medieval Europe. The law often gave a husband or a father the legal right to kill his wife or daughter and her lover if they were caught in the act of adultery. This was seen as a justifiable act of violence, a way to cleanse the family's honor of the stain of infidelity. The law did not see this as murder, but as a righteous act of a wronged man. The punishment for the woman and her lover was not just public shaming, it was often death, and it was often a violent and public one. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the depth of this double standard is the legal concept of chattel. While a wife was not technically a piece of property, she was often treated as such in legal matters. A husband could sue a lover for trespass or for damages to his property, which was a legal way of referring to his wife. The law was not concerned with the woman's feelings, her autonomy, or her choice. It was concerned with the man's claim over her, and his right to compensation for his loss. It was a cold, economic, and deeply misogynistic view of marriage and relationships. Historians still argue about the role of the Church in all of this. While the Church preached against violence and sought to regulate marriage, its own laws and doctrines often reinforced the same patriarchal structures. The concept of adultery was a sin, yes, but it was a sin that was punished differently for men and women. A man's infidelity was often seen as a minor transgression, a venial sin. A woman's infidelity, however, was a mortal sin, a violation of her wifely vows and a threat to the family unit. The Church, in its own way, perpetuated the very same double standards that were enshrined in secular law. The punishment for your crime of passion is not just the stocks. It's a public spectacle designed to be a permanent mark on your lives. As you are released, bruised, and humiliated, you are both branded with a hot iron. For you, it's a mark on your forehead, a letter A for adulteress. For Julian, it's a similar brand, perhaps on his cheek or hand. This is a permanent reminder of your crime. You will never be able to hide it. Every person you meet will know what you did. Every potential suitor will see the mark and turn away. Every future employer will see it and refuse you work. You are, in essence, marked for life, forever an outcast. This is the ultimate cruelty of medieval justice. It was designed not to rehabilitate, but to shame, to ostracize, and to create a permanent underclass of outcasts. Your love story, which began with stolen glances and whispered promises, ends with a brand, a permanent scar that serves as a warning to anyone who would dare to defy the rigid social and legal codes of the time. The punishment is not just about the pain, it is about the destruction of your future, the eradication of your hopes, and the public declaration that your love was not just a mistake, but a crime against society itself. You are no longer in the stocks, but the shame lingers like a bad scent. You are an outcast now, and the whispers follow you everywhere. The memory of the public humiliation is a fresh wound. But what about the other punishments? The ones that were less about love and more about simple gossip, the kind of small-town drama that's still alive and well today, only with much less terrifying consequences. You see, the medieval world was a tinderbox of social anxiety, and a loose tongue could be as dangerous as a loaded crossbow. Imagine, if you will, that you are not the one who fell in forbidden love. Instead, you are the busybody who told everyone about it. Your name is Agnes. You live down the lane, and you have an opinion on everything. You've been spreading rumors about the baker's wife, criticizing the blacksmith's work, and, yes, you were the one who gossiped about Julian and the maiden. but your tongue, it seems, has finally gotten you into trouble. Someone, perhaps the baker's wife, finally had enough and reported you to the magistrate. Your punishment? The ducking stool. A mainstream historical fact about the ducking stool is that it was not a torture device but a method of public humiliation. It was used primarily to punish scolds, gossips, and brawlers, essentially, women who were deemed too loud, too opinionated, or too disruptive to the peace of the community. The punishment was simple but effective. You would be strapped into a chair at the end of a long wooden plank, and then you would be plunged into a river, a pond, or a muddy puddle, not once, but several times. The idea was to literally cool your tongue and wash away your sin of gossip. The punishment was more psychological than physical, though it was certainly not pleasant. A quirky tidbit is that the ducking stool was often placed in a public square or by a bridge, so that as many people as possible could witness the spectacle. The crowds would jeer, throw rotten food, and cheer as you were plunged into the icy water. It was a form of public theatre, a spectacle of shame designed to entertain the masses while simultaneously enforcing social norms. The message was clear: silence yourself, or the community will do it for you. Historians still argue whether the ducking stool was used more as a form of social control against women or as a legitimate legal punishment for a recognized offense. It's a valid debate, as the vast majority of people punished by the ducking stool were women. Men who were gossips were often simply fined or given a warning. The punishment, it seems, was specifically designed to target women and their perceived vices, reinforcing the patriarchal idea that a woman's place was to be seen and not heard, and certainly not to have a public opinion. The experience of the ducking stool is a terrifying one. You're strapped in, the chair swaying precariously on the end of the plank. The magistrate reads your sentence aloud, detailing your transgressions for all to hear. The crowd's jeers are a deafening chorus. And then, with a lurch, you are plunged into the freezing, murky water. The shock is immense. You gasp, but the water fills your mouth. You fight to hold your breath as you are submerged, the cold seeping into your bones. Just as you think you can't hold on any longer, you are yanked back up, gasping for air. But the punishment isn't over. The crowd wants more. You are plunged again, and again, and again, until you are shivering, soaking wet, and your body is shaking uncontrollably. As you are finally released, dripping and humiliated, you are given a final warning. Any more gossip, any more scolding, and you will be back. The threat is not just of another icy bath, it is the threat of being an outcast, a pariah in a community where reputation is everything. You have been shamed in the most public way possible, and the memory of the cold water and the jeering crowd will stay with you forever, a silent, chilling reminder of the price of a loose tongue. You are shivering, dripping wet, and the humiliation of the ducking stool has left you speechless, quite literally. But what if your scolding and gossiping were a more persistent problem? What if the ducking stool didn't work? In the medieval world, justice was less about a single punishment and more about a persistent, often escalating, series of public shaming rituals. And for the perpetually talkative, there was a far more chilling solution than a cold bath. You are Agnes again, and this time, your tongue has not just landed you in a cold pond, it has earned you a new, metallic accessory. You are marched back to the public square, but this time, the magistrate holds something in his hands, a terrifying, helmet-like device made of iron. This, you are told, is the scold's bridle, and it is the next step in silencing you. A mainstream historical fact about the scold's bridle is that it was a particularly cruel and effective method of public humiliation. It was a metal mask, or sometimes just a simple cage for the head, with a small iron plate that would be inserted into your mouth. This plate would press down on your tongue, making it impossible to speak without causing immense pain. The bridle was then locked in place, and you would be led through the streets on a leash, a living spectacle of shame. The humiliation was not just the inability to speak, but the very act of being treated like a dangerous animal, a spectacle for the crowd to gawk at. A quirky tidbit that adds to the horror of this device is that some scolds' bridles were designed with sharp, protruding spikes on the tongue plate. This was not just to silence you, it was to inflict excruciating pain if you tried to move your tongue or make a sound. The slightest movement, the slightest attempt to speak, would result in a sharp, tearing pain in your mouth. The psychological impact of this device must have been immense, the constant, terrifying threat of pain for the simple act of trying to speak. Historians still argue whether the scold's bridle was a legitimate legal punishment or a form of vigilante justice. While some bridles were officially sanctioned by a court, others were made and used by local communities or even husbands to control their wives. The use of the bridle was not a punishment for a specific crime, but for a personality trait, being loud, argumentative, or gossipy. It was a tool of patriarchal control, designed to enforce silence and submission in women. The experience of the scold's bridle is a sensory assault. The cold iron presses against your skin, the metal taste fills your mouth, and the plate on your tongue feels like a heavy weight. You are led through the streets, unable to speak, unable to defend yourself, a living exhibit of the consequences of a loose tongue. People point and laugh. Children throw stones. You can hear their insults, but you cannot respond. You are a prisoner in your own body, silenced and humiliated, a silent scream of injustice trapped behind a mask of iron. This is the chilling progression of medieval punishment. It moves from the physical discomfort of the ducking stool to the psychological torture of the scold's bridle. The aim is the same, to enforce a specific code of conduct. But the scold's bridle takes it to a new level. It's not just a public humiliation, it's a physical and psychological silencing. It's a tool that takes away your voice, your ability to communicate, and your very humanity. And it leaves a lasting scar, not just on your body, but on your soul, a silent reminder that in this world, a woman's voice was a dangerous thing, a thing that had to be tamed, controlled, and, if necessary, silenced forever. The iron mask of the scold's bridle has been removed, but the memory of its cold, metallic taste on your tongue is a phantom limb you can't forget. Your voice, when you try to use it, is a hesitant, timid thing. But the medieval world had many other ways to punish, not just the loud, but the petty, the drunk, and the simply unlucky. And these punishments, you realize, are all about one thing: public shame. Let's turn our attention now to a different scene. You're a young man, a bit of a ne'er-do-well, perhaps. You've been caught stealing a loaf of bread from a market stall. Or maybe you were just a little too loud at the pub after a few too many flagons of ale. Your crime isn't heinous, but it's a crime nonetheless. The magistrate, a portly man with a permanent scowl, has a sentence for you. You will be placed in the pillory and stocks. A mainstream historical fact, the stocks and the pillory were two of the most common forms of public punishment in medieval Europe. The stocks were used for lesser offences, like brawling, minor theft, or public drunkenness. They were a simple wooden frame with holes for a person's ankles and, in some cases, wrists. The pillory, on the other hand, was a bit more serious. It was a wooden frame with holes for a person's head and hands, forcing them to stand upright. Both were designed to hold a person in a fixed, uncomfortable position in the public square, where they would be subjected to the ridicule and abuse of the crowd. A quirky tidbit is that the punishment wasn't just the physical discomfort. The duration of the sentence was often dictated by the mood of the crowd. The magistrate might set a sentence of 3 hours in the stocks, but if the crowd was particularly angry, or if the person was a known troublemaker, they might not be released until the crowd had had their fill of jeering, taunting, and throwing whatever they could get their hands on, rotten vegetables, mud, and even human waste. The punishment, you see, was less about a fixed sentence and more about the whims of the angry mob. Historians still argue whether the purpose of the stocks and pillory was to deter crime or to simply provide a form of public entertainment. It's a fascinating debate, as the two are not mutually exclusive. The spectacle of a person being humiliated in the public square was a form of entertainment, yes, but it was also a powerful deterrent. Everyone who saw the poor soul in the stocks knew that if they stepped out of line, they could be next. You're placed in the pillory, your head and hands locked in place. You can't see anything but the ground, your feet, and the curious, cruel faces of the crowd. The sun beats down on your head, and the wooden frame is rough against your skin. You can hear the insults, the laughter, and the sharp thud of a rotten apple hitting the wood next to your head. You flinch, but you can't move. You are a helpless target, a public spectacle, and there is nothing you can do but endure it. The punishment of the stocks and pillory was not designed to inflict serious physical harm. It was designed to inflict maximum public shame. It was a way of branding a person with their crime, not with a hot iron, but with a public memory. For the rest of your life, people would remember you as the man in the stocks, the one who was pelted with vegetables for stealing a loaf of bread. Your reputation would be forever stained, and that, in a small, close-knit community, was a punishment far worse than any jail sentence. The memory of the pillory still stings, a mix of sun-beaten skin and the echo of laughter. You were released, of course, eventually, but the shame, that's a punishment with no end. It follows you like a shadow. But the medieval world had an even more specific, and frankly, hilarious, punishment for one particular vice, public drunkenness. In a society where ale was a staple and public houses were the center of social life, getting a little too tipsy was a common occurrence. But getting drunk and disorderly was a crime, and it had a punishment to match. You're a man, let's call you Bartholomew, and you've had a few too many flagons of mead at the local tavern. You've been singing off-key songs, trying to dance on the table, and generally making a nuisance of yourself. The tavern owner, a large man with a very short temper, finally had enough. He calls the town guard, and you are dragged from the tavern, still singing your bawdy songs, and taken to the magistrate. The sentence, in this case, is not the stocks. It's something far more absurd and far more humiliating, the drunkard's cloak. A mainstream historical fact, the drunkard's cloak was a barrel, with a hole cut in the top for the head and two smaller holes for the arms. You would be forced to wear this barrel, a living, walking testament to your overindulgence. The barrel was often heavy, cumbersome, and incredibly undignified. You would be made to walk through the streets of the town, a public spectacle, and the crowd would jeer, laugh, and sometimes even throw things at you. The punishment was not designed to inflict physical pain, but to inflict maximum public shame. It was a visual representation of your crime, a walking, talking billboard of your transgression. A quirky tidbit is that the barrel itself often had a specific, and quite ironic, detail. The tap hole of the barrel was often left open, and a long pipe would be inserted, pointing out from the front of the barrel. This was a symbol of your sin, a constant, visual reminder of your thirst for ale. It was a clever, and cruel, detail that added to the absurdity of the punishment. Historians still argue whether the drunkard's cloak was a common punishment or a rare one. It's a fascinating debate, as the records of its use are sporadic. Some historians believe it was a common punishment in certain regions, while others argue that it was a more theatrical form of punishment reserved for particularly egregious offenders. Regardless of its frequency, the very existence of the drunkard's cloak tells us a lot about the medieval mindset. Crime was not just about breaking a law, it was about disrupting the social order, and the punishment had to be equally theatrical and public. You are wearing the barrel, and it is hot, heavy, and smells faintly of stale ale. You can't see your feet, and you keep stumbling. The crowd, a mix of curious onlookers and amused children, follows you, a chorus of laughter and taunts. You can hear them, but you can't respond. You are a human barrel, a public spectacle, and the weight of the barrel is nothing compared to the weight of the shame. This is the drunkard's cloak, a punishment that turns a simple act of overindulgence into a public performance of humiliation, and a lesson for all to see. The drunkard's cloak is a distant memory, a humbling lesson in the perils of public excess. But now, you find yourself in a different, and far stranger, legal proceeding. You're in a medieval courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a witness to a trial so bizarre, so utterly fantastic, that you would think it a fever dream. Before the judge, in a small, wooden cage, sits the accused, a pig. Yes, a pig. And this pig is on trial for murder. A mainstream historical fact that sounds like a joke but is absolutely true is that animals were put on trial in medieval Europe. The legal system, in its relentless pursuit of order, saw no distinction between human and animal when a crime was committed. If an animal caused a death, it was a crime, and the animal had to face justice. These trials were not a farce. They were formal, legal proceedings with all the trimmings, a judge, lawyers, who often spoke on behalf of the accused animal, and witnesses. The animal was often dressed in human clothing, and the court records were meticulously kept. A quirky tidbit that adds to the surreal nature of these trials is that the animals were often provided with a defense attorney. These attorneys would argue on behalf of the animal, often pleading that the animal was acting on instinct, or that it was the owner's fault for not controlling it. The lawyers would be paid for their services, just as they would for a human client. It was a bizarre, but very real, part of the medieval legal system. Historians still argue about the true purpose of these animal trials. Were they a genuine belief in animal sentience and responsibility? Or were they a way to enforce communal responsibility and send a message about the importance of order? It's a complex debate. Some historians believe that the trials were a way to cleanse the community of a perceived evil presence, whether it was a person or an animal. Others argue that it was a way to hold the owners of the animals responsible for their actions. In our current trial, the pig is accused of killing a small child who wandered too close to its pen. The prosecutor, a stern-faced man in a black robe, is arguing for the pig's execution. He describes the crime in vivid detail, painting the pig as a malicious, bloodthirsty creature. The defense attorney, a younger man, is arguing that the pig was simply acting on its natural instincts, and that the child's parents were at fault for their negligence. The trial is a spectacle, a bizarre blend of legal procedure and theatrical absurdity. The verdict, in this case, is not good for the pig. The jury, after a short deliberation, finds the pig guilty. The sentence is to be hanged, in the public square, as a warning to all the other pigs in the community, a ridiculous notion, but a very real one in the minds of the people who sanctioned these trials. The pig, you realize, is not just being punished, it is being made an example of, a scapegoat for the community's fear and desire for order. And as you watch the animal being led away, you can't help but wonder at the sheer, unadulterated madness of it all. The image of the pig being led to its fate stays with you, a chilling reminder of the utter strangeness of medieval justice. But if you thought putting an animal on trial was the pinnacle of bizarre cruelty, you were wrong. The medieval mind had a knack for creating punishments that were not just about public humiliation, but about inflicting a very specific, and very prolonged, form of physical and psychological torment. And a lot of this torment revolved around the simple, but terrifying, concept of stretching. Let's imagine you are a man, perhaps a peasant, who has been accused of a crime you didn't commit, say, treason against the local lord. The evidence is flimsy at best, but the Lord wants a confession. And in this era, a confession is not something you give willingly. It is something that is extracted. So, you are taken from your cell and led to a room filled with strange, menacing wooden devices. This is the torture chamber, and you are about to meet the rack. A mainstream historical fact, the rack was one of the most infamous and feared torture devices of the medieval and early modern periods. It was a simple, but effective, device, a rectangular frame, often made of wood, with rollers at one or both ends. Your ankles would be tied to one roller and your wrists to the other. The rollers would then be slowly turned, stretching your body, pulling your joints from their sockets, and tearing your muscles and ligaments. The pain, as you can imagine, was excruciating and unrelenting. The rack was used not as a punishment, but as a method of interrogation, a way to force a confession from a person, guilty or not. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the psychological cruelty of the rack is that the torturers would often start by just turning the rollers a little, enough to cause discomfort but not serious injury. They would then offer to stop if you would confess. The slow, methodical increase in tension was designed to break a person's will, to make them beg for the pain to stop, to confess to anything just to get off the rack. It was a mind game as much as it was a physical one, a battle of wills between the torturer and the accused. Historians still argue whether the rack was a widely used device or if its use was more limited. Some historians believe that it was a common tool of the Inquisition and other judicial systems, while others argue that it was a less common device, used only in cases of high treason or heresy. Regardless of its frequency, the very existence and fear of the rack tells us a lot about the nature of justice in this era. It was not about finding the truth, but about proving a narrative through whatever means necessary. You are strapped to the rack, and the ropes are tight against your wrists and ankles. The torturer, a burly man with a grim expression, begins to turn the roller. You feel a pull, a tightening sensation in your limbs. It's uncomfortable, but bearable. Confess, he says, his voice a low growl. Confess, and the pain will stop. You refuse. The roller turns again, and the pull becomes a sharp ache. You grit your teeth, trying to stay silent, but a small whimper escapes your lips. The roller turns again, and this time, the pain is a searing fire, a tearing sensation in your shoulders and hips. You feel your joints beginning to pull apart, and the world goes white with a blinding, all-consuming agony. You are being stretched beyond the limits of your body, and you know, with a sickening certainty, that the only way to make it stop is to confess to a crime you didn't commit. The rack, you realize, is not about justice. It is about a very specific, and very final, surrender of your will. The pain from the rack is a distant memory, a horror you pray will never return. You confessed, of course. You had to. The will to live is a powerful thing, and the human body can only endure so much. But the medieval world had even more horrifying tools of torment, devices that blurred the line between punishment and outright, theatrical murder. And the one we're going to talk about now is perhaps the most famous, and most debated, of them all, the Iron Maiden. Let's imagine you are an accused heretic, brought before the Inquisition. The room is dark, lit only by a few flickering candles. In the center of the room stands a large, iron sarcophagus, shaped like a woman, with a grim, impassive face. This, you are told, is the Iron Maiden, and it is where you will meet your fate. A mainstream historical fact about the Iron Maiden is that its very existence as a medieval torture device is a subject of intense scholarly debate. While the Iron Maiden is a staple of horror films and modern museums, most historians agree that the famous Nuremberg Iron Maiden was a hoax, a composite of different artifacts created in the late 18th century to cash in on the public's morbid fascination with the medieval period. The device as we know it, a sarcophagus lined with spikes that would slowly impale a person, likely never existed in the Middle Ages. A quirky tidbit that adds to this debate is that the first documented account of a device resembling the Iron Maiden comes from a German historian in 1793, who described a supposed execution device from the 16th century. This account, however, was written centuries after the supposed event, and no corroborating evidence from the time has ever been found. The Iron Maiden, it seems, is less a historical reality and more a product of the Gothic imagination of the late 18th century. Historians still argue whether any device similar to the Iron Maiden was ever used. Some scholars point to a few vague descriptions of virgins' cages or punishment cabinets from the 16th century, but these descriptions are so scarce and so lacking in detail that it's impossible to say for sure what they were. The Iron Maiden, in its popular form, is a perfect example of a historical myth, a story that is so compelling and so terrifying that it becomes a fact in the public imagination, even in the absence of any real evidence. So, as you stand before the grim, iron sarcophagus, you are not facing a real medieval torture device. You are facing a very modern myth. But in the dark, candlelit room, the terror is very real. The thought of being slowly impaled by 100 spikes is a fear that transcends history. It is a fear of the unknown, of a slow, painful death. And that, you realize, is the real power of the Iron Maiden, not in its use, but in its threat, in the terrifying image it creates in the mind. The Iron Maiden, in this sense, is a metaphor for the horrors of the medieval period. The real torture was not always the devices themselves, but the psychological torment, the fear, the isolation, and the very real threat of a gruesome, public death. The Iron Maiden, even if it is a myth, is a chilling reminder of the very real capacity for cruelty that existed in the medieval world. It is a symbol of a time when justice was often a theatre of pain, and a confession was often a matter of survival, not truth. You are no longer in the dark room with the mythical Iron Maiden. You are in a different place now, a place of historical certainty and unimaginable horror. You stand in a sun-baked public square, and before you is a massive, hollow bronze statue of a bull. But this is not a piece of art. It is a killing machine. This, you are told, is the brazen bull. A mainstream historical fact about the brazen bull is that it was an ancient Greek torture and execution device, not a medieval one, but its horrifying legend persisted throughout history. It was a hollow bronze statue of a bull, large enough to hold a person inside. The condemned would be placed inside the bull, and a fire would be lit underneath. As the bronze heated up, the person inside would slowly, and agonizingly, roast to death. The bull was designed with a system of tubes and pipes that would amplify the victim's screams, making them sound like the bellowing of an angry bull. The horror was not just the slow, excruciating death, but the theatrical cruelty of it all. The victim's suffering was turned into a perverse form of entertainment for the crowd. A quirky tidbit that adds to the grim legend of the brazen bull is that it was supposedly invented by a man named Perillos of Athens for Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas, in Sicily. Phalaris, in a moment of poetic justice, reportedly had Perillos be the first person to test his own invention. The inventor of the brazen bull was, in essence, the first person to experience its horrifying embrace. It's a classic case of the creator meeting his own creation, a grim tale of irony and hubris. Historians still argue about the true historical use of the brazen bull. While its existence is documented in ancient texts, it is often difficult to separate fact from legend. Some scholars believe that the brazen bull was a real device, used by tyrants to inflict a slow, agonizing death on their enemies. Others argue that it was more of a legend, a cautionary tale about the cruelty of tyrants. Regardless of its historical frequency, the brazen bull's legend is a powerful symbol of the capacity for human cruelty, a testament to the dark side of human nature. You are watching as a condemned prisoner, a man accused of treason, is forced into the brazen bull. The bronze door is shut, and a fire is lit underneath. The crowd watches in morbid fascination. You can hear the crackle of the fire, the murmur of the crowd, and then, a faint, muffled sound from inside the bull. It is a scream, but it is distorted, amplified, and made to sound like the tortured bellow of a beast. The sound is chilling, a horrifying mix of human agony and animalistic rage. The smell of burning flesh begins to fill the air, and the crowd grows silent, watching in morbid fascination as the bronze bull begins to glow a dull red. The brazen bull, you realize, is not just a torture device. It is a work of art, a horrifying masterpiece of human cruelty, and a grim reminder that some legends are rooted in a very dark, and very real, place. The heat from the brazen bull is a distant memory, a scorching nightmare you're glad you only witnessed from afar. But the medieval mind, in its relentless pursuit of brutal justice, had other methods of execution that were far more personal, and far more terrifying. These weren't elaborate devices from ancient legends, they were simple, horrifyingly effective methods of ending a life, methods that were as common as they were cruel. You're a young woman, and you've been accused of a crime that is considered particularly heinous, perhaps infanticide, or poisoning a rival. The evidence is shaky, but in this era, a confession, even a coerced one, is all that is needed. Your sentence is not the gallows. It is something far more intimate, and far more terrifying: drowning. A mainstream historical fact about drowning as a method of capital punishment is that it was a common form of execution for specific crimes, particularly those committed by women. It was seen as a way of purifying the body of the condemned, a way of washing away their sin in a public spectacle. The condemned would often be tied in a sack, sometimes with a cat or a dog, and thrown into a river, a lake, or a well. The act was a public one, a spectacle for the community to witness. The drowning was not a quick death, it was a slow, terrifying suffocation, a fight against the cold, dark water until the body finally gave in. A quirky tidbit is that the use of a sack for the condemned was a common practice, known as the poena calais, or the punishment of the sack. The sack was often made of leather, and it would be filled with various animals, a snake, a rooster, a dog, and then the condemned would be placed inside. The idea was to not only kill the person, but to also subject them to the terror of being bitten and scratched by the terrified animals inside the sack before they drowned. It was a punishment that was as psychologically cruel as it was physically brutal. Historians still argue whether drowning was a more humane form of execution than, say, hanging or burning. It's a difficult debate, as the very concept of humane is a modern one. Some historians argue that drowning was seen as a less public, less gruesome form of execution than others, and was therefore reserved for crimes that were considered particularly shameful. Others argue that drowning was just as cruel, if not more so, than other methods, and that the perceived humane aspect was just a way to make a brutal act more palatable to the public. You are placed in the sack, and the leather is rough against your skin. You can hear the terrified meowing of the cat inside with you, and the squawking of a rooster. The bag is tied shut, and you are lifted and carried to the river's edge. The crowd is silent now, watching in a morbid hush. You can feel the cold air on your face, and then, a sudden lurch, and you are plunged into the icy water. The sack is heavy, and you sink quickly. The water rushes into the sack, and you gasp, but only water fills your lungs. The cat scratches at your legs, and the rooster flails against your body, but their struggles are nothing compared to your own. You fight, you thrash, you struggle against the ropes, but it's useless. The cold, dark water is all around you, and you know, with a sickening certainty, that this is the end. And if drowning was a common form of execution, there was another, far more terrifying method for the most heinous of crimes: burial alive. A person, often a woman accused of a serious crime, would be taken to a field and placed in a hole in the ground. The hole would then be filled with dirt, slowly, agonizingly, until they were completely covered. It was a slow, terrifying suffocation, a fight for air as the dirt pressed in on you, a final act of cruelty that was as brutal as it was intimate. The ground, which gives life, was made to take it away, and the act was a public declaration that the person was so vile, so evil, that they deserved to be erased from the world in the most primal way possible. You are no longer in the murky depths of the river or the suffocating embrace of the earth. You are in a different place, a place of mass hysteria and terrifying paranoia. The year is 1484, and Pope Innocent VIII has just issued a bull, a papal decree, that has set the stage for one of the most brutal and bizarre legal phenomena in history, the witch trials. The world, it seems, has gone mad. You are a woman, perhaps a healer, a midwife, or just someone who is a little different from the rest of the community. You live on the fringes of the village, and you know a lot about herbs and folk remedies. People come to you for help, but they also whisper about you behind your back. Your knowledge is a gift, but in this new climate of fear, it is also a curse. A mainstream historical fact about the witch trials is that they were not a product of the Middle Ages, as is commonly believed, but were a phenomenon of the late medieval and early modern periods, reaching their peak in the 16th and 17th centuries. The trials were fueled by a combination of religious fervor, social anxiety, and, in some cases, political opportunism. The Church, with the help of books like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, provided a theological framework for the persecution of witches, and the secular authorities provided the legal and physical means to carry it out. A quirky tidbit that adds to the bizarre nature of the trials is the use of witch prickers to find a devil's mark. A witch pricker was a person who would travel from town to town, claiming to be able to find a spot on a person's body that was insensitive to pain. This mark, it was believed, was where the devil had touched the witch. The prickers would use a sharp needle to prick the accused, and if they didn't feel pain, or if the spot didn't bleed, it was considered proof of their guilt. Of course, the prickers were often frauds who used needles with retractable points to fake the lack of pain. It was a cruel and often deadly deception. Historians still argue whether the witch trials were a form of religious persecution or a social mechanism to control women. It's a complex debate. While a small number of men were also accused of witchcraft, the vast majority of the accused were women, often single women, widows, or women who were seen as too independent or outspoken. The trials were a way to silence and control women who didn't conform to the patriarchal norms of the time. The accusations of witchcraft were often a convenient way to get rid of a person who was disliked or feared by the community. You are brought before a panel of judges, and the accusations are read aloud. You are accused of making a neighbor's cow sick, of causing a hailstorm, of flying through the night on a broomstick, of having carnal knowledge of the devil. The accusations are wild, fantastical, and completely unprovable. But in this court, there is no need for proof. Your knowledge of herbs is twisted into a pact with the devil. Your independence is seen as a sign of your demonic possession. Your quiet, secluded life is seen as proof of your secret meetings with Satan. The trial is a farce, a theatrical condemnation. You are not allowed to have a lawyer. You are not allowed to call witnesses. And under the threat of torture, you are forced to confess. The confession, of course, is a script written for you. You confess to flying on a broomstick, to having sex with the devil, to everything they want you to say. The confession is all they need. The verdict is guilty. The sentence is to be burned at the stake. The bonfire is built in the public square, a terrifying pyre of wood and straw. The crowd, a mix of fearful and morbidly curious onlookers, watches as you are led to the pyre. The flames are lit, and the heat is intense. This, you realize with a cold dread, is the final act of this bizarre legal drama. Your knowledge, your independence, your life, all of it is being erased in a brutal, public spectacle, a testament to the power of fear and the madness of a world that has turned on itself. The flames of the pyre are a distant memory, a final, horrifying scene from a world gone mad. But as the smoke clears, you are no longer a victim. You are an observer, a modern mind looking back at this brutal, bizarre history. And in this final act, you are tasked with a single question: what is the legacy of all this cruelty? What do the ducking stools, the stocks, the brazen bulls, and the witch trials tell us about our own understanding of justice? The legacy is a complex one. The bizarre punishments of the past, with their emphasis on public shaming and theatrical cruelty, did not just disappear. They were gradually replaced by a more formal, more institutionalized form of justice. The public square, with its stocks and pillories, was replaced by the prison. The witch trials, with their reliance on superstition and coerced confessions, were replaced by legal systems that demanded evidence and due process. This is a mainstream historical fact. The evolution of justice has been a slow, uneven march away from public spectacle and toward private, institutionalized punishment. The idea of rehabilitation and reform is a relatively modern one. For most of human history, justice was about retribution and deterrence. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates this evolution is the invention of the penitentiary. The word penitentiary comes from the word penitence, and the original idea was not to punish people with physical labor, but to lock them in a quiet, isolated room where they could reflect on their sins and repent. The penitentiary was seen as a more humane alternative to the public hangings and floggings of the past. Of course, the reality of the penitentiary was often far from its utopian ideal, but the idea itself was a profound shift in thinking about justice. Historians still argue whether the modern legal system is truly better than the medieval one. While we no longer have public executions or trials for pigs, our legal system still has its own set of problems: mass incarceration, racial bias, and the use of solitary confinement, which is its own form of psychological torture. The modern system is, in many ways, a more sanitized, less theatrical version of the same impulse, to punish those who defy the social order. The difference is that the theater of cruelty is now hidden behind closed doors, in prisons and courtrooms, rather than in the public square. The legacy of these bizarre punishments is not just in the historical record. It's in our language, in our laws, and in our collective memory. The idea of a drunkard's cloak or a scold's bridle is a powerful symbol of a society that was obsessed with control and conformity. And the memory of the witch trials is a chilling reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria and the ease with which a society can turn on itself. The journey we've taken together, from forbidden love to the brazen bull, is a journey into the dark heart of human nature. It's a journey that reminds us that justice is not a fixed, immutable concept. It is a social construct, a reflection of the fears, prejudices, and values of the people who create it. The bizarre punishments of the past are not just historical curiosities. They are a mirror, a reflection of a part of ourselves that is still, perhaps, a little too comfortable with the idea of public shame, a little too quick to condemn, and a little too eager to see justice as an act of revenge. And in that reflection, we can see the true legacy of the medieval world, a legacy that reminds us that the line between justice and cruelty is a thin one, and it is a line that we, as a society, must always be vigilant to protect. And so our journey ends here tonight, with a final, quiet thought. The shadows of those bizarre, brutal punishments have faded, but their echoes, they still linger, don't they? In the stories we tell, in the very structure of our laws, in the way we think about right and wrong. Take a deep breath now, let the images of the past drift away, like smoke on a slow wind. The ducking stool is gone, its cold water now just a ripple on a quiet pond. The stocks are empty, the pillory stands silent in the moonlight. The fear and the anger, they belong to a time long ago. It's time to let go of the stories, to let the characters rest. They lived in a world of stark, unforgiving light, but you live here, now, in the gentle darkness of your room. The only judge here is the coming dawn, and its only sentence is a new day. So close your eyes. Let your mind become a calm, still lake, and let the surface be perfectly smooth. All those strange, old punishments, they're just history now. Just a bedtime story, told in a soft whisper, to ease you into a peaceful, well-deserved sleep. Sweet dreams.